All right, here's the second part of the IB bump process explained, and this is going to apply for courses only with provincial exams. It came to our attention yesterday in the department that the process that we outlined yesterday with the video on the IB bump was applying the bump to the final grade after it was all calculated. And that, in effect, is also providing a portion of that bump to the provincial exam, which is against the rules. So what we have to do is we've got to change the process for courses that have provincial exams just ever so slightly. Now, this is only going to apply to grade 12 Francais, grade 12 English, and grade 12 Math. So, again, just to quickly recap, in term 1, let's say the kid gets a calculated mark in my gradebook of 75%. We're going to apply just a 10% bump for the IB bump, whatever it might be, but I'm working on the assumption that it's just it's a straight 10% bump for argument's sake. So his calculated mark at 75% becomes 85%. When the grade store happens in Power School, 85% appears on the report card. The student carries the 75% over into term 2 because the gradebook just carries on into term 2. At the end of term 2, the student has now earned 80%. So what we're going to do is we're going to bump that 80% to 90%. The grade store happens and 90% appears on the report card. The exam comes along, the student writes the exam, earns 80% on the exam. That mark gets put into the grade store, 80%. Now, when we go to calculate the final mark for this course, the mark is weighted term 2, so all the classwork, September to January, is worth 70%, and the exam is weighted at 30%. So when we calculate the mark, what we want to make sure we're doing is that we want to make sure that we bring forward the 90% from term 2, not the calculated mark of 80%. We want to bring the 90% forward. We want to bring the 80% for the exam forward. Now, at a breakdown of 70-30, and with the student earning 90% in term 2, 80% for his exam, at that particular weighting scheme, my calculated mark will now come out to 87%. The student's received the bump, but he's only received the bump on his term 2 grade, and there's been no bump whatsoever applied to the exam score. So for those courses with provincial final exams, this is the process for doing your bump. And again, this is a process, or I've outlined the process for a term 1 and term 2 class. It'd be the same process if it was a year-long class. You'd be bumping term 4. And if it's a second semester course, you'd be bumping, again, term 4 again. You'd be bumping that last term. So the principle applies across the board. So how does this look in Power School? In term 1, the student in my gradebook gets a mark of, well, here they are, 65, 76, 79. Those are the marks that the gradebook calculates out to. So what I'm going to do is, in the mark inspector, I'm going to go in and I'm going to take this student's mark of 65.4. I'm going to apply my 10% bump to it as a manual override, put 75 in grade. That's what appears on the report card. That's what goes into the grade store. Term 2 comes along. In term 2, there are the student's grades as calculated by my grade book. What I want to do is I want to bump these scores as well. So in the grade inspector, the student's 79.6, I'm going to do a manual override, but I'm going to bump the grade by 10%, and I'm also going to change that percentage by 10% as well, and apply the bump to both percent and grade. This way the student carries the 89.6 forward into the calculation of his final grade. So the exam comes along, the students write the exam, teacher enters the marks as the students are scored on the exam, so there's nothing happening. I'm not doing any bump or anything special to the exams. Now, the way this all works out is that in Y1, when I select my Y1 reporting term, there are the final marks for this class. I'm not going to do any bumping to the Y1 marks because the bump happened in term 2. And how do we know this is all going to work? Well, we look at our grade setup for this particular course, and in Y1, you'll see that E1 is worth 30%, and those were the exam marks as entered, and term 2 is worth 70%, and that 70% is the term 2 mark, of course, is the mark that received the 10% bump. So this process won't affect provincial or weightings as far as term 1 and the exam is concerned in any way. It's not going to affect the final exam mark. All right. Hopefully that helps. And as always, if you have questions, Al and I are here, so shoot us an email.